Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Brene Lloyd, and I'm with Northwatch, and this is the fourth in our 13th annual Nuclear Waste Online webinar series. And I'm joined this evening by Susan O'Donnell from CRED, New Brunswick, Pat Gibbons from from SOS Great Lakes, and Kathy Brosmer is our chat master this evening. Kathy's also Northwatch's president. And Teresa McClenahan is our fourth speaker, who I see has just disappeared from the screen. So we'll maybe, oh, and she's back. Great. I'm joining you from Nipissing Territory in Robinson Huron Treaty Area in northeastern Ontario. And I would invite you all to introduce yourself through the chat and perhaps share your land acknowledgement there. So we're going to do just first a couple of introductory slides to get us started for our evening. So this evening session is Big Nuclear Expansionism in Canada. And just as an introduction, we're going to talk a few slides on context, and then Durham under duress, but actually Teresa's presentation is going to be broader than just Durham, although Durham certainly is under duress. Big to Bigger at Bruce. We'll hear from Pat Gibbons. And then Susan O'Donnell is going to walk us through where things are at with so-called small modular reactors. Then we'll go to a Q&A and talk next steps. So the context is that we have many nuclear facilities in Canada. We have a host of uranium mines. The operating mines are in Western Canada. And we also have nuclear fuel processing facilities in Blind River, Port Hope, Peterborough, Toronto, and then we have the reactors. The current operating reactors are at Bruce in Bruce County in southwestern Ontario, in Pickering and Darlington in Durham region, and then there's one lone reactor still operating in New Brunswick at Point Lepreau. So in the course of this, these reactors operating, and then there's also some research reactors operating at national facilities or universities. But to date, through operating the commercial and the pre-commercial reactors, Canada has generated 3.5 million bundles of nuclear waste. That's about 60,000 tons of high-level nuclear waste. And they've also generated at the reactors and at the fuel manufacturing facilities, hundreds of thousands of tons of low and intermediate level waste. So that is the legacy from operations to date. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa McClenahan. Teresa is Executive Director and Senior Counsel at Canadian Environmental Law Association. And Teresa is going to walk us through where we're at right now in terms of new nuclear projects. Thanks, Teresa.
You're welcome. How is my sound?
It's great.
Okay. I am in one of these situations where I can't really see you. I just see my slides. So please say something if you stop hearing me or seeing the slides. But thank you for inviting me back this year. And I titled this webinar musings and plans and musings, because some of the things we're talking about are not much more than news releases, but it's useful to get a picture of what they add up to. So many of you know CELA. We are a legal aid clinic specializing in environmental law and providing service across Ontario, as well as law reform services for both federal and provincial matters, and some cases if they are of national concern. And we have a related foundation where there is quite a bit of actual nuclear history located as well. So I'm going to talk very briefly about all of these items. I only have a few minutes, and fortunately, Susan and Pat will go into more detail on a couple of them. as well. But this is the overview. And by the way, I'm only talking about nuclear generation with this list. I'm not talking about any other type of nuclear activities or nuclear facilities, of which there are many, many. So first of all, for Darlington in Durham, we had hearings more than a decade ago, and the existing 4 plants have been undergoing refurbishment since 2016, and one is left to finish, and hold points under the license are being lifted bit by bit on the other 3 that are finished. The hope OPG has is that these will operate for 30 more years. And shockingly, OPG is seeking a 30-year license in its application to renew its license. It expires at the end of this year. This is the license for the current facility. And you can intervene by May 8th by following the forms at the commission. And the hearings are in June, with part 1 hearing earlier than that. But May 8th is when you would have to get your application to intervene in, which can consist of a written submission, a letter. You can also ask to present in person if you wish, or virtually. But 30-year license is very, very long. We used to see a norm of 2 or 3 years. Then over our concerns, they started to stretch out to 5. And then shockingly, we saw applications for 10. They actually started to get some licenses for 10 years. We've seen one application before for 30 years, which was not granted. We will vigorously resist this. CELA will be representing the Durham Nuclear Awareness and Slovenia Home Association at this hearing. Among the reasons are it's a real effort to withdraw public participation, capacity, oversight, accountability, in my opinion. Then we have the Bruce refurbishment. So I'm sure we'll hear more about this from Pat in a few moments. This began, life extension and major component refurbishment began in 2020. Prior work had been underway before that. For 6 units, they're replacing all of the major parts. And then again, they anticipate another 30-year life, which if you stretch out all the work to the date that they expect to finish, then 2034 plus 30 would take them to 2064. So we're talking about decades and decades of additional operation of these 2 major plants at Darlington and Bruce, if all goes the way they wish. Then there's Darlington new build. So this is a proposed BWRX 300, which is being styled as a small modular reactor. You'll hear more about small modular reactors from Susan in a few moments. And they eventually admitted that they were actually hoping to build up to 4 units of this type. The application so far that's gone through a hearing is for the first one, or for one. And they would be 300 megawatts per unit. They hope to operate that for 60 years. The environmental assessment was over a decade ago, and this technology was not in play at that time. And in the end, there was no specific technology in play because the province had ended its procurement push for new nuclear, but OPG continued and obtained the license in any event. So they did obtain a license to prepare a site, have been preparing the site. Now in January, they just appeared at the hearing for a license to construct, and the decision is not out yet. The interveners, including ourselves, objected that the design was incomplete, that the safety systems were inadequate, that we're losing a lot of the defense in depth that they like to claim in the industry that they have. And very concerningly, major request for delegation of decisions to staff of the commission as opposed to the commissioners on very, very significant matters. And really, it's premature in my opinion. It should not have gone to a license hearing yet at all. And they argued that other jurisdictions are watching this licensing process. Bruce refurbishment, again, you'll hear more about that. Did I just repeat that slide? Sorry. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Boy, oh boy. There we go. Bruce new build. So this is a proposal for Bruce C. For another new nuclear option, again with no technology chosen, just as was the case a decade ago at Darlington, up to 4,800 megawatts. They have started a federal impact assessment. It's very early stages. There was a call for comment recently on the project description, and then it's been paused for further consultation at this stage. Bruce says in their material that it will be technology neutral and use a plant parameter envelope approach, which I'm very sad to say we contested in the federal courts 10, 15 years ago. And after many ups and downs in the course of those proceedings, in the end, the CNSC decision was held not to be unreasonable, and the OPG at the time was allowed to proceed with that kind of an approach where they posited a non-existent outer envelope based on mashing a number of different technologies together, basically, in terms of potential emissions and other matters, as opposed to evaluating a specific nuclear generation technology. And so Bruce is saying they're going to take that same approach here. Pickering, shockingly, for those of us who've been anticipating that Pickering will finally be closing despite the vociferous objections we've had to its extension beyond anything reasonable, again, in my opinion, because of its age. And then most recently, the province asked Ontario Power Generation about a year and a half or 2 years ago to prepare a business case about what it would look like feasibly and economically to refurbish Pickering. And then just last month asked OPG to begin work on design and engineering to developing cost and schedule estimates and committed a couple of $2 billion to that work. Obviously, there's no application yet to the CNSC for that because they're just at the beginning of design and engineering work. But there is, interestingly, an EBR posting with comment open right now until mid-March with this title, Advancing Nuclear Opportunities in Ontario, which when I skimmed it, because I haven't really studied it yet, is about making changes to the way the accounting is done to deal with the capital cost and the upfront design cost and the overall cost of the facility and how that gets dealt with on the books. And so some of the groups who have interest in the economic side might want to take a look at that one and put comments in, as well as the rest of you. Okay, so then there's also been this is the category of musing that's started in 2024. I frankly think because of the fact that we were then approaching the possibility of and now are in a provincial election here in Ontario. So the province asked OPG to examine using other sites for new large electrical generation. And they asked the province to look at using generation with natural gas, with small or large nuclear, hydrogen, or battery storage. And the 3 specific sites they mentioned were Wesleyville, near Port Hope, Nanticoke, and Lambton. Nanticoke, just south of me. I'm in Paris in the Grand River Valley here. So down on Lake Erie is Nanticoke, and then Lambton is in southwest Ontario, also on Lake Erie. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. So for Wesleyville, Ontario last month asked somewhat more formally, rather than just a musing and press release, asked OPG to explore opportunities for new nuclear. So the more specific again than the range of energy options that I had listed a moment ago at Wesleyville, and to determine support in local communities. And if you want to read how they framed it, I've put that there. The site is already maintained by Ontario Power Generation because years and years and years ago it had been planned for electrical generation, and that had never proceeded at the time. And in April of 2022, the municipality was about to proceed with a plan for new housing and natural heritage, and then the province stepped in and stopped that from proceeding. And then subsequently, we saw these further developments in 2024 and 2025. Nanticoke and Lambton are both former operating Ontario power generation coal generation plants, or Ontario Hydro, as the case may be. They were shut down and decommissioned. The province has asked them to look at the sites for new generation, that range that I mentioned. They have access to existing transmission grids. They have ports on the Great Lakes, Lake Erie specifically. They're zoned for power generation. They're owned by OPG. At Nanticoke presently, there's industrial activity and solar generation, a very large solar facility, and then nearby a very, very large wind facility with First Nations partners, and my municipality actually is involved in some of that, Brant. And then in terms of municipalities, the province is offering municipalities funds to explore and develop host agreements, and says that they won't proceed without willing hosts. Of course, no specific proposals so far, and OPG says it's in early stages, and I don't have a good read on whether there would ever be a serious proposal for nuclear at these sites. I would find that a bit shocking for reasons I'll get into in a moment. But we may well see a big proposal for one of these options at one of these sites or both of these sites. And then other developments, there's been research underway at Point Lepreau and Chalk River. Susan will talk about that. There was this policy document developed with federal government and some provinces and some agencies called the SMR Roadmap, as well as some federal departments. And Saskatchewan and Alberta have particularly talked about the advantage of using small modular reactors as a way to reduce the energy intensity of oil production. And more recently, Sask Power entered into a service agreement with Ontario Power Generation for a potential BWRX 300, the same technology that they're seeking to construct at Darlington. But they say in that link that I have there that the parties are, quote, watching Ontario as it goes through the regulatory process. So last slide, why is this all happening? I was at the Globe and Mail hosted a day-long conference the other day, last week or the week before, that I attended. And the mantra was absolutely economic and supply chain through and through. Really, it's about the supply chain. Supply chain has grown very deep and extensive in Canada and in Ontario in particular. And there is a lot of economic activity going along with that, and therefore a lot of economic and lobbying clout. OPG, of course, is owned by the Ontario shareholders, if you're not aware of that. So they have a direct line to decision making that way as well. Public statements have included the Ontario desire for energy security or even to be an energy powerhouse. This actually just even preceded the tariff threats from the US, including for exporting energy. There's been statement by the IESO that they would like to pursue all of the no regrets options and therefore want OPG exploring some of these ideas. And then there are calculations about new demand from electrification of buildings and transportation and much else, EVs, producing hydrogen, for example, in the Southwest, and powering artificial intelligence, as well as I mentioned, decarbonizing the oil sands. On the other hand, and interestingly, at that conference the other day, I mentioned nothing on the right-hand list here, really, was addressed that day, except a little teeny bit at the very, very end of the day on what public concern might be. Um, and but there are huge issues of the risks, of the cost and time of these big projects, especially if they're being argued to be a solution to climate risk, which is completely inadequate in that case, if that's what you're using as the basis for your argument. Of course, the major issues around safety and emergency planning. There's really way too much concentration on one energy source in Ontario in particular. We're at, I think, around 60% production right now as we speak from nuclear, although maybe a bit more from gas right now while they're doing the refurbishments. But if you had either an accident or some major realization that there was a technology quirk, or you had, some of the anticipated impacts around climate change in terms of water temperature or other big issues. What's happened sometimes in countries that have had that happen is they've had to shut down their fleet. And we'd be really up a creek here in Ontario if that happened, with this kind of putting all the eggs in one basket. One thing that did get mentioned at that conference and has been mentioned often by the industry, including at regulatory hearings, is coordination of the workforce availability and supply chain capacity for the contractors and subcontractors. And that's partly why I raise my eyebrows a lot about the prospect of new nuclear at Nanticoke and Lambton. Of course, with the arguments in the prairies about decarbonizing oil sands, it then also perpetuates fossil fuels. If the plan is to use SMRs, including the proposal at Darlington and maybe in Saskatchewan, the designs are very immature and untested, and other SMR designs, as you heard from Susan, are even more immature and untested even than that. And then there's a huge opportunity cost of not pursuing renewables as well as conservation, storage, demand management, et cetera, albeit granted more recently, the Ontario government has started to call for some of that again after backing away from it for a long time. So that's it, Renee. I will turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Teresa. That was excellent. And now we're going to turn to Bruce. We're going to hear from Pat Gibbons. Pat is with SOS Great Lakes, which is a Bruce County-based organization, excellent organization formed around the time that Nuclear Waste Management Organization was soliciting interest in the Deep Geological Repository for high-level waste, and Ontario Power Generation was at the same time promoting a deep geological repository for low and intermediate level waste, now failed. And so SOS is a excellent organization, and we're so fortunate to have that organizing base in Bruce County. So with that, Pat, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Renee. I'm a resident of Southampton, Ontario, which is about 20 kilometers from the Bruce Nuclear Power Plant. And as Renee mentioned, I've been a member of SOS Great Lakes for about 15 years from its beginning. And the mandate of SOS Great Lakes was or is to prevent the burial of high and intermediate level nuclear waste anywhere in the Great Lakes Basin. Okay, next slide, please, Renee. Southampton, as I said, is 30 kilometers from the Bruce Nuclear Plant, where presently there are 8 reactors. And as Teresa said, some of them are undergoing refurbishment. There are 4 at Bruce A and 4 at Bruce B. And if you slip back to the first slide, Renee, and I just wanted to make mention of where Bruce C might be located. And that would be up in the upper right corner elongated. Another one would be another possibility would be along Lake Huron. So that would be in the top left. And a third site would be below Bruce B, which is in the lower part. Now, one of the issues is that there is a number of things happening in that yellow square that you see on your screen. We can go back to the other slide now, Renee. There is the burial of, not the burial, I'm sorry, but the storage of much of Ontario's nuclear waste on that site as well. Bruce Power is located on the Saugeen First Nations territory. And after many years of negatively impacting the land, water, and air, the nuclear industry has only recently bothered to consult the First Nations. Bruce Power, by the way, leases the land and the reactors from OPG, Ontario Power Generation. And likely the same thing would be happening with Bruce C. And all of the waste from the Bruce belongs to the Ontario Power Generation, or the province of Ontario. Next slide, please, Bryn. Bruce C project would provide an additional 4,800 megawatts of nuclear capacity. 2 years ago, Bruce Power began engaging with local municipalities, First Nations, selected community members, and the media about plans for the Bruce C project. So that was before they actually started any type of assessment by the federal government. In August of 2024, Bruce Power initiated the impact assessment process for the Bruce C project. And we can flip to the next slide. As Teresa mentioned, the reactor technology for Bruce C has not yet been selected. There are multiple options being considered, and Bruce Power is using, as was mentioned earlier, the plant parameter envelope to make the development of the project technology neutral, meaning that any technology being considered would meet the parameters that have been predetermined. The next slide, please, Bernay. The Monarch can-do reactor from Atkins-Realis, which many of us know from their former name of SNC-Lavalin, is presently the most advanced and having the highest output of the reactors being considered. Next slide, please, Bernay. I want to just make one comment. Teresa mentioned that I would be discussing the refurbishment. Well, I'm not doing that. The refurbishment has been going on. It's employing a lot of people. Our area is expanding very quickly. It's probably one of the fastest growing areas in not only in Ontario, but in Canada because of what's happening at the Bruce, basically. It's also, if you haven't been there, the shores of Lake Huron have the best sunsets, and it's the tourist area that probably challenges the Bruce Power for the number of people who are in the area. It's a very high tourist area. Now with this slide, the Bruce C project will be reviewed under the Impact Assessment Act with a joint review panel selected jointly by the Impact Assessment Agency as well as CNSC. That will include a public hearing that will take place during that process. And you can see at the bottom of that previous slide that there are a number of participants involved in the impact assessment. We have the proponent, obviously, Indigenous people, municipalities, some of the people who are here, like Renee and Teresa, and any public member can also participate in the public hearing. Next slide, please. The Bruce C project is presently at the planning stage, the very beginning stage of the impact assessment. August the 1st, as I mentioned, 2024 was when Bruce Power presented the initial project description to the impact assessment agency. A public comment period occurred between August the 12th and October 28th, fairly short period actually. And then on November the 6th, a week later, the Impact Assessment Agency posted a summary of the issues from the public comment period. On December the 6th, Bruce Power provided an initial response to the summary of issues. And on the 20th of December, the agency referred the project to an independent review panel. But then on January the 15th, Bruce Power requested a suspension of the assessment. That stage has a 108-day timeline, and the suspension stops the clock while Bruce Power is doing a couple of things. And in the next slide, the suspension that was granted by the Impact Assessment Agency. The reason that Bruce Power asked for that was to allow for additional engagement activities with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. That is the territory that Bruce Power is on. The Saugeen Ojibwe Nation is quite strong in the area, and Bruce Power, Ontario Nuclear Management Organization, as well as OPG, are all doing what they can to appease Saugeen. We all thought that an area within South Bruce would be the home of Canada's high-level nuclear waste. I personally did, but I know that Saugeen would not allow it, and I think that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was aware of that as well. Slide 8, is that where we're at now? Yeah, don't go back to the one you were at, please, Brene. The second suspension, as I said, was to allow for more engagement with SON. That is a very important aspect. Slide 9. So, as was mentioned earlier, the Bruce C project is in the first of the 5 phases of the Impact Assessment Act. Phase 1 is there's allotted 6 months for the planning, but because of the suspension of the timeline, it will go beyond the 6 months. Phase 2 is the impact assessment statement being prepared by Bruce Power. Phase 3, the impact assessment by the IAA as well as the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which will take about 10 months. And then phase 4 will be a decision made by the Impact Assessment Agency. And that'll be about 3 months. Next slide. So to summarize, there are a number of steps within the planning stage of the impact assessment. The initial project description was filed by Bruce Power. Public comments on the initial description happened during September and into October. The agency posted a summary of issues from the comments received during the comment period, and documents have been posted on the impact assessment registry. So the next part of this, after the suspension is over, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada will issue tailored impact assessment statement guidelines and terms of reference for further comment. Finally, the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, as long as what they still call the person after the next election, will refer the assessment to an integrated review panel. The next slide. This is just showing where we are, where we've come from. Phase 1, the initial project description, comments received and posted, or the summary of the issues were posted by the agency. Bruce Power submitted a response to some of the issues, and the agency will determine, or has determined, that an impact assessment is required. So we're on hold at this point. And at the same time, the Impact Assessment Agency and CNSC will be developing tailored impact statement guidelines in terms of reference for comments. And the final slide, to get more information about the Bruce C project, really there are 2 places. The Impact Assessment Agency has a directory of all of the documents that are coming in, and the Bruce Power site will give their view of the project and where it's going.
Great, thanks very much, Pat. That was a really helpful summary, and it's a complicated process. We've been through it before for a couple of other projects. We'll be going through something similar for the Deep Geological Repository that the NWMO is pursuing, but we're right in the thick of it with Bruce right now. With that, we're going to turn ourselves to Susan O'Donnell with Coalition Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. And Susan is going to walk us through where we're at with so-called small modular reactor development in Canada. So thank you, Pat, and over to you, Susan.
Thank you. I just realized that hold on a second. I just realized that well, hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to talk about my favorite subject. I'll just put it that way. As I was saying just before we started, I'm quite obsessed with this topic. So small reactors, they're actually smaller reactors, SMRs or SMNRs. What that refers to is not the physical size, because they're not actually all that small. It refers to the electrical output. The existing CANDU reactors that we have in Canada range from about a little over 500 megawatts electric to almost 900 megawatts electric. And SMRs or SMNRs are 300 megawatts electric and lower. So that's what it means. That's when they say small, that's what they mean. Okay. I'm grateful to live and work on the unceded homeland of the Wolastoqiyik, and the beautiful and bountiful Wolastoq is just a few hundred meters from where I am sitting right now. So the talk about small modular reactors ramped up in a big way in 2018 with the publication of this report, the SMR roadmap, that was a collaboration between the nuclear industry and its partner in government, which is the Federal Department of Natural Resources Canada, which has the obligation, the brief, to promote and support the industry, as well as to oversee the nuclear regulator. And then the next year, there were 3 provinces that Ontario and New Brunswick, which, as Brene mentioned, are the only provinces that have operating nuclear power reactors in Canada, plus Saskatchewan. The 3 of them signed a memorandum of understanding. Alberta joined the next year. And what that MOU binds these provinces to do is to both promote and support the development of small modular reactors, but also to lobby the federal government to label nuclear power as clean energy, which they succeeded in doing. And then the next year, there was an SMR action plan, and that's when the federal funding started to flow. So far, it's been mostly federal funding for SMR, some provincial funding. It's totaled about 1.2 billion in low interest loans and grants. There's been very little private funding. And then in 2023, the Canada Energy Regulator put out a report modeling energy use by 2050, which put in their report, in their model, they put SMRs in almost every province by 2050. That the nuclear aspect of that report is deeply flawed, and if you're interested, please ask me a question about that. And then more recently, just a couple of weeks ago, the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, Jonathan Wilkinson, said that the first SMR will be connected to the grid in a couple of years, and referring to the Darlington new build that Teresa talked about. So that is the closest one right now to actually realization in Canada. So at the same time that the government was and the nuclear industry was ramping up the talk about SMRs, civil society started to ramp up their opposition in 2018. Also in 2018, that was the first resolution passed against SMRs at the Assembly of First Nations. There's been several since then. And why is there opposition? Teresa talked about some of it. Certainly nuclear power is by far the most expensive way to generate electricity. There's major concerns with unproven SMR designs. There's concerns about the fuel that they're using, specifically enriched fuel and plutonium-based fuels, and then new forms of radioactive waste that these reactors, if they're built, will generate. I've just put some names there of some of the organizations and people who've been identifying some of these risks. In 2021, there were 130 groups across Canada that signed a statement that's still on the website of CELA. SMRs are a dirty, dangerous distraction from climate change. In 2023 and 2024, there was the nuclear lobby in Ottawa, and that photo on the slide here, you might recognize some of the people. This was from a very successful media event that happened at the National Press Theatre during that lobby. And then more recently, just a little less than a year ago, there was another international petition, and 130 groups across Canada signed it, for asking for no public funding for nuclear energy. Okay, I'm going to go across the country now and tell you what's happening in each of the provinces that have some involvement with nuclear and SMRs. So on some of the provincial maps, you're going to see an X. A black X means that there's just been talk about it. There's nothing firm proposed, or there might be a proposal, but there's nothing actually happening. So Nova Scotia is fairly new to this discussion because in 2009, the province passed a law against uranium mining. And you might be aware that more recently, the government has just gone kind of on steroids with resource extraction. They've been talking about all kinds of things, including uranium mining. And in fact, I believe it was just last week or the week before that there were changes in the legislature proposed, changes in legislation proposed that would support potentially uranium mining and nuclear development. And there has been talk of an SMR build in Unama'ki, Cape Breton. Okay, New Brunswick, there's a red X because it's a live proposal. This is the site of the Point Lepreau nuclear site on the Bay of Fundy. And there's actually NB Power, our provincial utility, is supporting the development of 2 SMRs. The companies moved into New Brunswick in 2018. One's from the US and one's from the UK. They're both startups. And so far they've received about 85 million in support, mostly federal support, some provincial support. And the status now is that neither of those companies have been successful in getting the money that they say they need to build their reactors. And so we're just waiting to see what the next step is, because NB Power has announced for quite a while that they want to put 600 megawatts of new nuclear aside the existing Point Lepreau reactor. And we're just waiting to see what they're going to propose for what kind of reactors. We're assuming it's going to be 2 SMRs, but it's not clear what's going to happen. I'm going to make my slides available. I don't have time to talk about the specific reactor types, but I'd be happy to answer questions about any of these. All I wanted to show on this one is that the CEO of the ARC company has said they need 500 million in cash to develop the design to get to the point of applying for a license to build it. And at that point, they'll need 600 million in a power purchase agreement to take it any further. And they've come nowhere near getting that amount of money. Similarly, the CEO of Moltex has said that his company needs 500 million to continue developing the reactor. And again, even though they've received the biggest grant from the federal government, they've come nowhere near to attracting the investment that they need. So in Quebec, a new government 13 years ago shut down the power reactor at Gentil 2. And then in 2023, there was a new CEO of Hydro-Québec who talked about starting it up again. They actually did a feasibility study. They talked about potentially adding SMRs to that site. But then last year, Hydro-Québec signed an agreement with Newfoundland and Labrador to build new hydro projects in Labrador. And so at the time, they said because of that nuclear is not in their current plans. And I just want to give a shout out, since we're talking about Quebec, that the federal Bloc Québécois are in Parliament. They have demonstrated very strong opposition to SMRs and nuclear energy, along with, of course, the Green Party that has against nuclear in its policy book, and also the NDP has made statements against nuclear as well. Ontario, as Teresa and Pat have said, is really the epicenter of the nuclear industry. They were the first. There was a company in Ontario that were the first ones to get federal funding for SMR development. It was a company called Terrestrial Energy. However, there's no proponent for that design, so it doesn't seem to be going anywhere right now, I would say. And then 2 years later, Ontario Power Generation, OPG, got a federal 975 million, what they're calling a low interest loan, and that is to develop that American design, the BWRX 300. So That stands for, these initials stand for Boiling Water Reactor version 10, BWRX. And the 300 means it's a 300 megawatt reactor planned. And Teresa talked about that. It's also called the Darlington New Build. And then the next year, there was more federal funding coming in to a company, Westinghouse Canada, also based in Ontario, to develop a reactor called the eVinci reactor. I'll mention that again when I talk about Saskatchewan. There was, so that's where the X is here, the red X is the Darlington nuclear site. The black X is where the Chalk River nuclear labs are. There was a demonstration SMR planned that was talked about for a number of years, but it seems to have been abandoned now. There's still, well, the company that was proposing it has gone under bankruptcy protection, or has gone bankrupt, I'm not sure which, but there is still SMR research going on at the Chalk River Nuclear Lab. The same the Canadian Nuclear Labs is also working with McMaster University in Hamilton, conducting research on SMRs. So that's happening in Ontario. Right, this is just a diagram of the BWRX 300 design, the Darlington New Build. I just wanted to make the point how they're actually not small. If it is actually built, it will be 73 meters high, which is 10 meters above ground and 10 stories above ground and 11 stories below ground. So it just gives you an idea. They're not small, they're just small in output. All right, so going west to Manitoba. About 5 years ago, there was a company that just appeared called Starcore Nuclear that was proposing to build an SMR for Pinawa, which is near the Whiteshell nuclear site. So there is a nuclear site here. There was a research reactor that was shut down about 35 years ago. Just northeast of Winnipeg, but there wasn't really much heard about it for the last 5 years, until just at the end of last year. All of a sudden, there was a flurry of meetings with the government and First Nations, and now this has a name. It's called Project Whiteshell. But still, there's no public funding for it. It hasn't undergone any kind of design review by the our nuclear regulator, the CNSC. And also last year, the Chambers of Commerce in the province have been promoting SMRs or talking about SMRs as potentially part of Manitoba's Green Advantage strategy. So that's it for Manitoba. Saskatchewan, as I mentioned, the government signed an MOU in 2019. And as Teresa mentioned, the Sask Power, the utility, has chosen the GE Hitachi design, the BWRX 300, and they said they will make their final decision in 2029. They want to see if this machine that they're building at Darlington actually works, basically. At the same time, there was new federal money coming into Saskatchewan. There was 74 million that came in. It looks like what happened is that provincial government gave a 6 million top up and then handed the 80 million to the Saskatchewan Research Council that signed an MOU with Westinghouse to develop the eVinci reactor. So there's all these MOUs going on and all these plans and feasibilities and such is what's happening, and it's happening in Saskatchewan. But they did ID this site at Estevan, or a couple of sites around Estevan, which is just north of the border with North Dakota. The interesting thing is, of course, like in all the provinces, is the Saskatchewan government wants the federal government to pay for it. This is where it's all going to come back to. This is the eVinci design. It's a micro reactor, a micro modular reactor, and there's some interesting links there with the U.S. Department of Defense. I would answer questions about that if you're interested. So Alberta, as I said, they were late to this provincial MOU. As Teresa mentioned, they're talking about using SMRs to decarbonize oil and gas extraction. They have signed an MOU with the company now based in New Brunswick. Again, feasibility studies going on. interestingly, there's a new company called Energy Alberta that at the same time is developing a plan for 4 CANDU reactors in the Peace River region. So, but there's no X's on that map because there's nothing actually proposed for SMRs in Alberta. British Columbia is a bit of a surprise because they have a Clean Energy Act that bans nuclear power. But just last year in the provincial election that happened, the BC Conservative Party included SMRs in a big way in their election platform. And so, it's still online. If anyone on the call here is from New Brunswick, you might want to download that because I think it will definitely feature again in the next provincial election campaign. So this is my last slide, final thoughts on SMRs. The big question is, where is the money going to come from? Each reactor is going to cost a minimum of $5 billion, and that's really lowballing it. And so if these things are going to be rolled out across the country and actually make a difference to, meeting our net zero targets, it's going to cost not tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and nobody knows where the money's going to come from because there's been almost zero private investment because they're such a bad investment, because they're the most expensive way to generate electricity. All the money's going into renewables. And so far, all the federal government's given, 1.2 billion, it's not pocket change, it's a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to what they're going to need. And so far, what the federal government has offered is tax breaks, and that's not what the industry wants. They want the cash. So what about what's on the horizon? Well, Pierre Poilievre has said that if he is elected, his government will unleash the power of our atoms. That's a quote. Do not know what that means. Mark Carney has this on his website right now, that if he's elected, his government will invest to become a clean energy superpower in nuclear, hydro, wind, hydrogen, battery, carbon capture. I did notice that nuclear is mentioned first. Again, don't know what that means. I would say that right now, certainly my analysis is that the SMR discourse and politics function primarily to delay the energy transitions needed for climate action. So that's basically what they're doing. I am going to put these slides up on the Cedar Project website, and Bernaine said she would send out that URL when she sends out the recording. So if you're interested, you can download them from there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Susan. That was an excellent overview. So it's time for our Q&A session. And we do have a slide, but I'm not going to show it. I'm just going to simply remind you that questions should be respectful, courteous. And when you're posting questions, if you could please post one question at a time. And I'll remind our panelists, if you could go to the Q&A section and indicate which of those questions you would like to answer. That just shortens our whole process up a little bit and saves you the risk of me lobbing a question at you that you'd rather not answer, although I may do that anyway. So our first question, I'll actually send it to myself. It's a question from Colleen, and she tells us that in U.S. For Seno-free nuclear waste, there's an op-ed piece that recently stated that Canada has formally announced the selection of an informed and willing host community. Residents in the township of Ignis confirmed their willingness in a vote, with 77% of respondents affirming their support. A majority of Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation also agreed to host a spent fuel repository. With the selection complete after nearly 15 years, Canada is now poised to begin a regulatory review. So let's unbundle that a little bit. It is true that the siting process took about 15 years. Much of the rest of that statement is not accurate. So, for example, the situation is NWMO did on November 28th announce the selection of the Revel site, which is between Ignis and Dryden. There was an online poll held by the Township of Ignis. They're 45 kilometers east of the site in a different watershed. The industry designated them as the host community, their proxy decision maker. They held an online poll, and it was a minority of eligible participants, but it was a majority of those who did participate in the poll supported, answered yes in response to the question, do you support continuing in the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's process? So it was, in fact, not a question to support burial of waste in the region, but to continue receiving millions of dollars from the industry on the basis of participating. Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation, on the other hand, designated by NWMO as the other potential host community because they are the closest downstream First Nation. Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation held a community vote, and their community vote determined that they were willing to have the NWMO move to the next stage in studies. So they accept moving to site characterization. They said very clearly that this does not constitute support for the Deep Geological Repository, and they will in fact have their own assessment process through which they'll make their decisions. So reporting not quite accurate, but we're hearing that kind of inaccurate reporting a lot. So thank you for your patience as I insert that correction into this session. Our next question is from Jan, and Jan, this is a question about refurbishment, and Teresa, I'll pass that to you. If you could just give a brief explanation of what refurbishment entails.
Right. So the question is, do you restart the plant when done refurbishment, or do you, oh, what happened to it? There we go.
Oh, sorry.
Do you still run the plant while you're upgrading and refurbishing? So for the can-dos, which are the ones that are underway right now, are multi-unit plants, meaning there's more than one nuclear generating unit on the site. Once they start refurbishment, they cannot be operating that particular unit until they are done. And even when they're done, there are a number of things that need to be tested, and the commission needs to be satisfied, the safety commission, before they can turn it back on. But what is happening is that they're working on multiple units at a time in a staggered way. So they start one, and then partway through that one, they start the next one, and partway through that one, they start the next one.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. Next question is from Ole, and it's about Bruce C. And the question, I don't know, Pat, if you'd like to take this one, or Teresa, or I could help out with it. The question is, on Bruce C, could the agency, Impact Assessment Agency, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission decide to not have a dedicated hearing on the impact assessment and instead combine an impact assessment hearing with a CNSC licensing hearing? Pat, do you want to weigh in on that?
I really don't have the experience with. I have been surprised at some of the decisions that CNSC has made around Darlington and Pickering. So I wouldn't want to guess, but there might be a legal part to the act that requires a hearing.
So I'll wade in, and Teresa, maybe you can add. So based on past experience, observation, so Darlington new build, they combined the license to prepare a site with the impact assessment process. That time it was an environmental assessment process. For the Deep Geological Repository, for low and intermediate level waste, they combined not just the license to prepare the site, but also the license to construct with the environmental assessment process. I expect with Bruce C, they'll combine the license to prepare the site with the impact assessment. They have not yet, by my recollection, indicated which will be the case, but that's my expectation. Teresa, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the difference is that we have a new Impact Assessment Act now, and because one of the members of the panel would be appointed by the CNSC and two by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, through the agency, the only way they could combine the license is if the minister and the agency were willing to have those members cross-appointed as members of the tribunal, which is what was done in those cases that you mentioned. So I don't think I've seen anything that says whether that's been decided yet in this situation. It's not legally impossible because they do set up processes in the legislation to allow for harmonized hearings. So it well could happen, but they'd have to be willing to make those accommodations in cross appointments.
Okay, thanks. Another question from all. Are large power utilities so focused on generating revenues for electricity that they resist encouraging energy conservation? Teresa or Susan?
Yeah, so well, I'll talk about Ontario anyway. There are two things going on. One is that there's been a real push to, as we saw, increase nuclear generation, both in absolute terms and in share of generation. That's been a tendency for decades now in Ontario, that the former Ontario Hydro and now Ontario Power Generation wanted to do that. And there were previous big plans with hearings, and there were, opportunities for input, and those failed. And now those opportunities have vanished from the regulatory and decision-making landscape. And so the decisions are being made strictly at the political level with the utility and the cabinet. So that's one thing that is having that result. And so my view is that because of that, for a while there was a tendency to agree on renewables and conservation in Ontario because the coal plants were being shut down, and there was perceived to be a gap happening for a while that needed to be filled. Decisions were made not to pursue those renewable options. Therefore, we're using more natural gas right now, which was meant to be just peaking power, but now is kind of filling that gap while refurbishments are happening. And in the meantime, the focus on conservation and renewables had abated. As I mentioned before, now they're starting to bring those back, and I have seen in their power plan and some of their consultations that they want to pursue all options. The second thing is that there is this concern that I have seen utilities express, like even at the small utility local distribution scale, that the public is told they're going to save money with conservation efforts, but the utilities, once they've invested the money in the capital, still want to recover their investment. And so they worry that the public is being deceived, because all that's going to happen is the rates are going to have to go up if the amount of conservation per person is decreasing. And related to that is, as different players who consume can get off the grid with their own supply in one way or another, it leaves the rest of the population who are kind of remaining there, particularly those without capital, low-income consumers, for example, bearing a proportionately larger share of the remaining grid or power supply. So yeah, that's a complicated answer, but that's kind of what's in play.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. A question for Pat from Sarah around the Monarch, whether it's a likely choice for the site C, for Bruce C. Are we sure? And I don't know, Pat, if you want to wade in that, I would say we're not sure.
Yeah, I don't think anything's a sure thing. They just haven't named, and they'll probably wait as long as they can to select the type of reactor that they want to use. So no, I may have misled the people who are listening here by mentioning the Monarch, but it's just that has the highest output, and it's the most advanced of any of the ones that they tell us they're considering. But no, it's definitely not a sure thing.
Yeah, and I think it is the one that's been referenced relative to Bruce C more, more or maybe even exclusively. Another question from Sarah, and this one I'll pass to Teresa. So, Teresa, do you know, have they started blasting yet at Darlington for the
Well,
BWR?
Susan says she wants to answer that one because
Go ahead.
I'd have to check. I'm trying to remember.
Oh, okay. Well, as far as I understand, because they don't have a license to build yet, as far as I understand, they're not allowed to do any of that blasting. But
They have a
what
license to prepare a site. I just can't remember how far that lets them go. I think that lets them mainly do grading. Yeah.
mainly do grading, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the one thing I did want to mention, because I was in a situation where I actually made a intervention to that license hearing, where I did mention the fact that Darlington is on a fault line. And this is way out of my expertise because I'm not a geologist. I am aware that the engineers there are aware of that particular situation. But it obviously is something that they would want to be considering before they dig 11 stories or more below ground to be building that reactor. So I take your point, Sarah, that, it's good to raise questions about such things, but I'm going to assume that the engineers are aware of such problems and are looking after it and know that they haven't started yet. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Susan, keep your mic on. Another question from Sarah, which I'll also direct to you. If you could talk about, Sarah's asking if you could talk about the Westinghouse connections to the U.S. Department of Defense.
Yeah, sure. Well, for a lot of these, I'm sorry, I'm hearing, for a lot of these SMRs, there's connections between the companies in the US and in Canada. Like some of the reactors I mentioned have received funding not only from the Canadian government, but from the US government. But the eVinci is an interesting one because, as far as I'm aware, all or most of the early development costs were paid by the US Department of Defense. And one thing that they asked specifically is that the specifications for the eVinci reactor have to fit on a Department of Defense transport truck, the specific specifications, so that the reactor can be used in deployment situations by the American military. So it is being developed in Canada. I'm not sure what's happening with the US, but it's closely tied to the American military. And as far as I view that particular reactor, the main client for it at the moment is the American military because they're heavily invested in it. So that's the answer, Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Susan. I'm going to pass a question. I'm going to give you a break, Susan. The next couple of questions, I think, are for you, but I'm going to skip down and pass this question to Teresa. It's a question from Janice. How do you see tariffs impacting these already costly nuclear projects? Teresa, do you want to take a step at that?
Well, I can tell you what the industry was saying at that Globe and Mail conference the other day, which is that they were saying everything was Canadian. The Westinghouse process was Canadian, the new can-do is Canadian, that all the supply chain is Canadian. There was a lot of flag waving. In terms of whether it would result in cutbacks on safety, I don't see a direct line there, but cost is an issue, and we already see that with the choice of the BWRX 300, where Ole, who's on this call, as well as others who weighed in at that hearing that we're waiting for a decision on, pointed out that there had been mention of cost as a significant factor in the design choice.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. Another question, another SMR question. This one for you, Susan. Does the proliferation of SMRs also come with a nuclear waste problem? Are there any ways that supporters say the waste can be dealt with? Susan, over to you.
Oh, I'll start that one and then I'll turn it back to Brene because she's also following this one. So the issue is that many of the SMR designs are going to be producing the type of nuclear waste, especially if you look at the used fuel waste, that has not been produced in Canada before. And so there are many questions about them. For example, the ARC 100 reactor that I mentioned is being proposed for New Brunswick. Uses a sodium coolant, and the sodium is a reactive material, so it reacts with air and with water. It cannot be exposed or it creates fires or potentially some kind of explosions, but certainly it's flammable. And so it has to be removed from the used fuel before it can be stored safely. And currently there are no commercial level means to separate sodium from used fuel, for example. So there's all kinds of issues related to the fuel itself that the questions haven't been answered yet. There's the BWRX 300 is planning to use enriched fuel, which creates a different category of used fuel waste. And so again, we don't know how these fuel wastes are going to be stored. Maybe I'll just turn it over to Bernaine. I'm kind of mumbling now because we have talked about this and Bernaine's been following this one.
Okay, thanks, Susan. So actually, Ole and I spoke about this in more detail in our second webinar, which was on the integrated strategy for radioactive waste. So back 2016, when SMRs first became a promotional campaign on the part of the industry supported by government, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was saying, we can handle it. No problem. It's within our mandate. We can handle the SMR waste. In 2020, the Federal Minister of Natural Resources gave the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, whose mandate is limited to nuclear irradiated fuel waste, nuclear fuel waste from reactors, gave them a second mandate to develop for recommendation to him a strategy for the management of low and intermediate level waste. NWMO came back to the minister 2 years later and said, here's an idea, let's have another deep geological repository and we'll design it, build it, we'll do the consultation, we'll site it, we'll do the consultation on it. And the minister, with no consultation or engagement with the public or Indigenous people, said, I accept that. Although he never actually endorsed the plan, but he acknowledged the plan. And industry is now left to their own devices to do that. And since that time, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has increasingly been playing mix and match or a shell game with the deep geological repository they've been developing since their recommendation in 2005 to have a deep geological repository for high-level nuclear fuel waste. And the deep geological repository, they are now going to develop a siting process for, and then develop a DGR, they presume, for intermediate level waste. They're now saying, well, the SMR waste could potentially go in the deep geological repository for intermediate level waste. And they have even more recently said that in commenting on the Bruce C initial project description, they also referenced the deep geological repository they're developing under the Integrated Strategy for Radioactive Waste, which we call DGR3 for short. So in summary, there's no plan, and the industry is going to play a shell game and say it's handled, but how they're going to handle it, and as Susan has pointed out, the SMR wastes are very different from the can-do waste, and they haven't yet got a really demonstrated plan or solution for the can-do waste. So next question is from Philip. And Philip asks, am I understanding the financial situation correctly, that there is no real money going into SMRs, that it is basically public funds going in?
So I answered that question in writing, but Susan might want to elaborate. But I mentioned the 900 million in the federal budget because Philip, the second part of his question was to ask, is that right? And I responded to the second one.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I will maybe just add to that. You see, in Ontario, which is supposedly the richest province, you guys seem to have unlimited money. And I know that's not true. And so, I know that there are activists pointing a spotlight on how much money is being invested in these nuclear programs. In New Brunswick, we've only got 800 million or 800,000 people in the whole province, and it's not a very rich province. And so these questions about finances are really like under a microscope. There's no way we could come up with, $5 billion to build a reactor. It's just absolutely impossible. But Ontario seems to think it's going to come up with hundreds of billions of dollars to build their reactors. And it's just a big question. Like, Teresa, how the heck is this going to happen? I don't know.
Well, one thing that's going on in Ontario is that the provincial government is underwriting a massive amount of our electricity rates. That's been happening for quite a few years. With Darlington, they used something. Oh, where's Jack when I need him? There's a particular account that was used to finance it, and then eventually other types of projects went in there as well, and there's a portion of people's utility bill that goes to paying that down. But that consultation that's posted on Ontario's environmental registry right now about the future of nuclear is focused on those financing accounting questions for the Pickering refurbishment question, it seems. So that is a good place for people to look there.
Great, thanks. Next question from Agnes. I'm going to answer it quickly by saying I'll send you some links. Agnes asks, is it possible to look at public comments anywhere on the different projects? So I'll send a link with the follow-up, a link to the Bruce C comments and a link to the comments, the most recent comments on the Darlington license to construct as starting points on this. A question from Mary. Does the scope of the impact assessment for new nuclear projects and nuclear refurbishment include environmental impacts of extracting uranium? Do they need to identify the sources of uranium and establish that they have adequately consulted with First Nations when the mining takes place? Teresa, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so the way that the regulatory process works in Canada is that it's bifurcated project by project and proponent by proponent. So there are licenses issued for the mines, and there are licenses issued for the fuel processing, refining, and then licenses issued for the fuel processing. There's licenses issued for the reactors, licenses issued usually for the waste. They may be different locations, different proponents. No, they are not required to do that, even on the impact assessment side, if and when they're subject to impact assessment, which was narrowed a lot under the revised legislation. They still don't have to take account of those upstream and downstream effects adequately. We often wish that they would, and we call for them to do so, but they don't, in fact, tend to do that. And certainly when they have a completely separated process like they do for mining, they won't roll that into the impact assessment on the reactor side.
Great, thanks, Teresa. We've got several questions left, and it is 8:29, so I think we'll take Clarissa's question as the last question we'll take. And I might just shorten up some of these. A question from Janice. She heard John Valiant, who wrote the book Fire Weather, say that Canada has the potential to provide renewable energy for the whole of North America. Does anyone know where that info came from? And was it from Professor Mark Jacobson of Stanford University? Susan, do you want to take that?
I don't know who said that. I know in Canada, the David Suzuki Foundation certainly has a plan for an all renewable Canada. As far as renewable for all of North America, it could well be Mark Jacobson, because he's probably the foremost person to do that modeling on an international level, but I couldn't say that for sure.
Great, thanks. And another question from Janice, I think also for you, maybe, Susan. She'd heard that the new reactors will have to come from the United States. Can you comment on that?
The fuel for them.
Oh, the fuel from them. Oh, sorry. I'm very short-sighted. I'm having difficulty reading these questions.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, let's just to make clear, in case it wasn't clear from all of these, that we don't know what's actually going to be built, right? And that includes the big reactors and the so-called smaller reactors, SMRs. If the Darlington new build goes ahead, yes, the fuel will have to come from the US because it's enriched fuel, and we do not have an enrichment plant in Canada for sure. The other reactors that have been proposed so far for New Brunswick, yes, fuel from somewhere, and or they're going to make their own plutonium-based fuel. But just to say that we do not know what reactors are actually going to be built, and so we don't know where the fuel is going to come from. I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thanks. A question I'm going to send to Teresa from Mary. If the NWMO's authority is established by statute, was limited to storing spent nuclear fuel waste, is it legal for them to have an expanded mandate to deal with other types of nuclear waste? Can this be challenged? Teresa, do you want to have a...
Well, I'd refer you to the Nuclear Waste Watch website that Renee maintains on behalf of all of us, where we were doing quite a bit of work on the nuclear waste policy a few years ago. And the Minister of Natural Resources tasked NWMO to come up with a proposal for a plan for the intermediate level waste. And can it be challenged if the legislation's not amended? Possibly, or the legislation could end up being amended. So.
And I'll just add to that, that I did an access to information request about discussions within Natural Resources Canada about a review of the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act. And I did it because the Fuel Waste Act hasn't been reviewed or revised since 2002. And also motivated by the NWMO, I believe, are acting outside their legislated mandate. And the response was very interesting, and it was very much about whether the NWMO is acting within, whether the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act needs to be amended or not. And it was particularly sparked around the time of Lori Swamy from NWMO making her remarks at the Canadian Nuclear Association annual meeting February last, a year ago, about the deep geological repository for intermediate level waste possibly being available to SMR waste. So it is a live question within Natural Resources Canada, according to that access to information request. Another question, also from Mary, doesn't Canada have some policy says that we will only use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes? Shouldn't any planned use of US military be challenged in Parliament? I'm going to assume this is related to maybe the plutonium extraction. Susan, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, just really briefly, Mary, there's a lot of links between the Canadian government and the nuclear program here and the US military. Ole Hendrickson has written a fair bit about that. What this really means is that we're not going to be a nuclear weapon state. That's basically it, because it seems that a lot of other things are on the table. There's talk about, about plutonium extraction here, reprocessing. There's issues around how the fuel, or sorry, the uranium that goes to be processed into enriched uranium in the States, what happens to some of that, the link with the nuclear weapons programs in the States. So there's lots of links between Canada and nuclear weapons, let's just put it that way, and the military. It's just that we don't have nuclear weapons ourselves, and that's what they primarily mean by that.
Great, thanks, Susan. Two more questions, one from Judith I'll send to Teresa, and then a final one from Clarissa. I'm going to send to Susan. So a question from Judith to Teresa. Is there a way to remind the CNSC that our obligations under the International Atomic Energy Agency, or Act, is to have nuclear safety segment of our government from the promotion, from the pro-nuclear promotion department of our government? We have a captured nuclear safety agency. Also, what about getting Parliament to be in charge of nuclear planning, not private offshore private industry? Teresa, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, the Canadian, the concerned citizens of Renfrew County and area, along with CELA, but led by OL, drafted a petition to the Auditor General about the captured regulator problem, and about the need for carrying through with the previously intended separation of the oversight of promotion from regulation at the ministerial level. Right now, it's the same minister in charge of both the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, as well as in charge of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited and their contracts with CNL and so forth. That is something that was intended to be addressed when the legislation was changed from the old Atomic Energy Control Act, but it's just never been followed through. The response we got was that it was the purview of the Prime Minister in terms of deciding on the way to structure government and ministerial responsibilities. On the captured industry question, I wrote a chapter in a recent publication called Corporate Rules, which is a very readable book. You can get it from the publisher, Lorimer Press, or from any other major publisher. Each chapter deals with a major hazardous industry, and I highly recommend it. There's one on transportation, like oil and gas transportation. There's one on food and drug. There's one on nuclear.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. And final question is from Clarissa. Oh, and there's a poll up. So we had a whole set of polls, but this is the only one we're going to actually run because I forgot to run them. So final question from Clarissa. So why the rush to nuclear? It's the most expensive mode of producing energy. Takes a lot of time to get it up and going. And there are no solutions yet for safely dealing with the waste. So over to you, Susan. A big question.
I think you could do an entire webinar and we could all give our opinions on that. I'm sure we have all kinds of thoughts about that. I would say it's important to separate it completely from this idea that it's a climate action tool, all right? Because that's not what this is about. What it's about is saying it's a climate action tool in order to get the money for clean energy that they need to keep this going. There's a lot of other reasons for it. It has to do with so-called security, national defense. It has to do with the links to the American military that I was talking about. There's all kinds of reasons for it that have nothing to do with climate action. And I think if, we can keep banging our heads against the wall saying the same things over and over again, because it makes no sense as a climate solution. There are other reasons for it, and I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Thanks, Susan, so much. So we ran a little poll. I'm going to try to share the results. I don't know if it'll work or not. But let me just say that we asked, would you commit 2 to 3 hours per month to contribute to a campaign to make the nuclear industry more accountable? Great majority said yes. One person said no. A couple said depends on the campaign. Very fair answer. And a few more said undecided, also a fair answer. So I think overall, I think we're good to go. And I want to thank our speakers, excellent presentations and Q&A, and I want to thank all of our participants hanging in as we go over our allotted time. And I want to thank everybody who's participated in all of the sessions this February. This is our 4th session of 4. So I don't have to show that final slide reminding you of the next sessions, but I will be sending a follow-up out with the links from today's sessions, requesting for links that came up in today's sessions and some of the previous sessions, and links to all of the recordings. So thank you all very much, and lots to work to do, and we'll look forward to doing it with you.
Thanks everyone for your interest. Bye.